Do you mind if I follow up on that just a little bit? I was not saying Luke was wrong. I think of the two, Luke was probably more accurate. I think probably Matthew, who you probably agree with me, who tended to exaggerate Old Testament prophecies and reform them into the New Testament. Matthew was probably the one who was wrong. If one of those two was right, I would give it to Luke. So I wasn't questioning Luke's historicity. I think he would be more of a reliable writer than Matthew. Do you agree with me there?
Probably in broad principle, but from the beginning I've been saying that I don't think that the material about Jesus' childhood is nearly as reliable historically, or at least not nearly as checkable historically as his public career. I put a lot more historical weight on what we know about Jesus as an adult than I would on what we know about Jesus as a child.
Thank Dan for his questions, and now pass the torch of questioning back across to Chris.
Can you give me a moment just to find the right bit of numbers?
Yes, if you want to, give you a minute. Feel free to chat quietly amongst yourselves.
Did you get any of this part? Sorry? Maybe. I bet she says. Yeah? Cool. Because I recognize you somewhere, but I'm getting confused by Wait, was this the first one? Yes! Yes, it was.
Just call you back to order quickly, and I'll leave you in Chris's hands to take the questioning again.
I may not use up all my time here, so Dan, if you want to make your answer a little more expansive, you probably have room to do that. I'd like to focus down on what I think is the only really good example of a dying and rising God in Greco-Roman antiquity, and that's the example of Osiris. There's no real argument that Osiris was a god who was meant to die and rise. How comparable do you think that is to the claim of the early Christians about Jesus, given that the claim about Osiris was a self-consciously mythical claim? Now, what I mean by that is no believer in Osiris thought there was a particular year in which Osiris died and rose again. Osiris died and rose again every year, with the grain coming back and the green coming back after winter. Whereas the specific nature of the early Christian claim is that Jesus died and rose in a particular year at a particular time and place. Are these really comparable claims?
Yes and no. Any religion, to be a distinct religion from something else, is going to have its differences. West Side Story has a number of amazing differences between the story of Romeo and Juliet. That's what makes it its own story. Christians, in fact, have every year celebrated Easter, coincidentally around the time of the vernal equinox, which is the beginning of spring, which was signaling the fertility idea that we find in Egyptian cycles of birth and rebirth and death and rebirth. So you can see echoes of ancient pagan fertility rotations within early Christian teachings, at least. But oh, we're out of time.
No, that's it's just you need to pose another question if you want.
Yeah, but we do see, as you say, Osiris is one example of a kind of, what would we say, paradigm or template or idea in the air that was shared to some degree or other by other peoples. You know, in Greece it became Dionysus. It became a kind of a similar, what do you call Dionysus? Kind of a Greek version of Osiris, I guess. And the mystery cults, which we don't know much about because they were mystery cults, had similar types of rituals and celebrations. And in fact, I understand, I mean, you can correct me on this, that the tomb of Dionysus was being regularly visited by believers many years later, you know, where he was dead. So there was a tomb veneration of him as well. So there are similarities and there are differences. That's about the best I can say.
You think Dionysus is a dying and rising god?
Yeah, I think he was based on Osiris as a type of, you know, as a god-man who was put to death and then came back again. So, yeah, I think Dionysus fits within that as a dying and rising God. Certainly there were people who continued to worship this man long after his death.
See, it's my understanding that there's quite a lot of dying gods, but there aren't actually many dying and rising gods. Do you know of any ancient source that describes Dionysus as a dying and rising god? Because I don't.
I don't hear either, but I'm just going by secondary scholarship on this. You might be right on that. But in any event, the template doesn't have to match perfectly.
The template has to match a bit.
Well, we do know that Caesar Augustus was claimed to have ascended, right? And he was deified. He was a human being who was deified. And we do know that Suetonius wrote that after Caesar Augustus died, he was seen to ascend to heaven. Now, you might call that a spiritual ascension or a bodily ascension, but you have the same ambiguity, as you agree, with the way Paul described the ascension of Jesus.
Do you know of anybody who suggests at all that Caesar Augustus had come bodily back to life?
Last question.
The way that the ascension of Caesar Augustus is described is similar to the way that the egiro, the waking up, and the ophthe, appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 are described by Paul as like a spiritual resurrecting into heaven. So if Caesar Augustus did not bodily ascend, then neither did Jesus. Both of them were described in these sort of visionary spiritual terms. By the way, I disagree with you that Paul was referring to a bodily ascension of Jesus. In fact, he even said, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He knew the word resurrection and didn't use it. He used these ambiguous terms, which could just as equally apply to me saying that my grandma died and went to heaven. The exact same kinds of words. And by the way, I'll repeat, that, you know, the appearances of Moses and Elijah on the Transfiguration, the same word, ophthe, they appeared to Jesus and Peter and James, but no one thinks their bodies were there. No one's looking for the empty grave of Moses. That was a visionary experience. The exact same words are used by Paul in 1 Corinthians to describe the visionary appearance. And even in his own testimony, he did not physically meet, he didn't shake hands with Jesus. Paul lumps his visionary spiritual experience with the risen Jesus in the same terminology that he describes all the other ones. So we do know that there is extreme ambiguity about the nature of a physical body rising from the dead. If it applies to Jesus, the same thing applies to Caesar Augustus.
No more questions, Lord.
So, you've got to answer. So I thank Chris for his questions. I now hand the brand back across to Dan to give his final cross-examination.
Well, then let me continue with this and ask you, from what you know about 1 Corinthians 15, did Paul have a physical encounter with a body that had raised from the dead when he describes his conversion experience on the road to Damascus? Or did he have something less than a physical experience, by his own description?
Well, I think by his own description he thought it was a visionary experience. The reason I think that he believes in the bodily resurrection of Jesus comes later in the same passage, where he talks about the resurrection that he presumes the Corinthians will also experience. And he very carefully describes that in terms of metaphors with grain that dies and rises again. Yes, you're right, there's that general agricultural metaphor being used. But the point is, he says very carefully, there are different kinds of bodies. There's the grain, and there's the new growth of the plant. And the point seems to be that there is both change and continuity. And he emphasizes both the change and the continuity. But the metaphor seems to me to strongly suggest, and I think this is a mainstream view, the metaphor seems to strongly suggest that he thinks that the resurrection body is physical in the same way that the physical body before resurrection is, on the analogy of grain and wheat.
All right, that made perfect sense. Because was it a physical body or wasn't it? And since you agree that Paul's own description of his appearance of the resurrected Jesus was more like a visionary, in the same passage in which he uses the exact same word to describe the appearances to the other early Christians, then what's to keep scholars and non-professional amateurs like myself from concluding that he was using the same word in the same sense through that entire passage of of 1 Corinthians 15? Why can we not view the entire thing the same way that you view Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration? Can you fault me for thinking that when I take those words for what you admit they actually mean?
No, it's a perfectly possible reading of the passage. It's just not the one suggested by the broader context.
By the what?
Broader context. The rest of Paul's argument about the nature of resurrection.